representation here of the Lord actively fighting on behalf of his people. We're told that the angel of the Lord, or the angel of God who was before the people, went behind them, and the pillar of cloud went from before them to behind them. We're then told that people began to complain. Moses relays this to the Lord, and the Lord literally tells Moses, tell them to be quiet and just watch. In a rather foreshadowing tone of just be quiet. So we then see the Lord parts with a strong east wind, parts the sea, the people pass on dry ground, only to then have the Egyptians follow them. But the Lord then fights on behalf of the people, causing the dry ground to become mud. The Egyptian chariots' wheels and horses' hooves are sticking. And then as the people exit the sea, the Lord causes the sea itself to collapse back on top of the Egyptian army. So that's where we're picking up today, in verse 1 of chapter 15. Then Moses and the people of Israel sang this song to the Lord, saying, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord, or Yahweh, is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his host he cast into the sea, and his chosen officers were sunk in the Red Sea. The floods covered them. They went down to the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shatters the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrew your adversaries. You send out your fury. It consumes them like stubble. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The floods stood in a heap. The deep congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake. I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its fill of them. I will draw my sword. My hand shall destroy them. You blew with your wind. The sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Or who is like you, O Yahweh, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand, and the earth swallowed them. You have led in your steadfast love the people whom you have redeemed. You have guided them by your strength to your holy abode. The peoples have heard, they tremble. Pangs have seized the inhabitants of Philistia, and the chiefs of Edom are dismayed. Trembling seizes the leaders of Moab. All the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. Terror and dread fall upon them because of the greatness of your arm. They are still as stone till your people, O Lord, pass by, till the people pass by whom you have purchased. You will bring them in and plant them on your own mountain, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your abode, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. The Lord will reign forever and ever. I'm going to pause there before we continue working through chapter 15 and just take a bit to look at this. Now, this is specifically the Song of Moses, but also the Song of the People, the Song of the Sea, as it is often called. And it is, I think, properly termed the first psalm, as the structure here could almost have been, as actually I think there is a psalm that quotes most of it later on, because they included it. But specifically, it's the first liturgical worship song given to the newly minted, or about to be minted, people of Israel. So we see a note on worship here that the proper and truest and most primal, if you will, or the first, before being contaminated, song of the people of God, as the first time they're formally a people of God, is all about what the Lord has done. So I think that's important, but also we get a couple of points and references through the song that tell us a couple things about what else is going on. Now, up until this point, in this lesson series, have mentioned the leaders of Canaan and the effect of what would likely be happening, but this is actually the first time textually that we're giving any reference outside of the frame of Egypt. So we see in the later part, we're told, that the kings of Philistia, the kings of Edom, Moab, the Canaanites, all of those are quaking. Now, we know from the historical record that up until this point, all of that region, most of Canaan, Philistine, almost all the way over to India in places, was under the either direct rule of Thutmose III, Pharaoh of Egypt, or under the conquered but semi-autonomous sending taxes to Egypt rule of Egypt. So the fact that this group of rabble slaves and their unknown God has broken the might of Pharaoh has them far more terrified than anything Pharaoh ever did. We know from records both in Egypt and archaeological finds from the Canaanite cities that they've been sending fairly hefty taxes. They have been offering up, hey, don't come attack us again, to Pharaoh. And now Pharaoh's army is shattered. The nation of Egypt is decimated, both economically, socially, religiously. And that's actually, that's a side note. I don't want to do that. So we see here in the song that Moses is already foretelling. So yes, this is not written down at the exact second they're crossing. So Moses may be having a little bit of looking back here. But also, this wasn't a one weekend for all the plagues in the Exodus. So reports are coming in. Diplomacy is still happening. Merchants are still carrying word. Even through the fall of Egypt, there's still merchant caravans going in and out. So the fame of the Lord here and what he's done in Egypt has spread far and wide, even by this point. And we know, sorry, I thought you were just, and we know when we come to the narratives concerning later on the conquest that even 40 years later, they're still terrified to a supernatural degree. So we see that. The other thing we see that I actually want to really take some effort on to look into here in the song is actually a microcosm or a miniature of a major theological theme. Now, you say, well, yes, the Lord conquering his enemies. Well, that's part of it. But actually we see, and the theme here, and I've mentioned it in other series, is the idea of through the waters to the mountain to worship. And this is actually throughout the entire Hebrew Old Testament, and their entire worship idea is that the waters, which represent both the people on earth, as we see consistently through the prophets, but also the chaos, you have to go through that to the mountain of God's choosing, so you can't just worship God anywhere. And historically, mountains being both in proper Hebrew understanding, but also even in a lesser defiled pagan understanding, mountains are the places the deities dwell. So this idea of through the waters of chaos to the mountain of the God's choosing, in this case of Yahweh's choosing, to worship him, and can only be worshipped him on the mountain, is a reinforced theme, and this is arguably the most literal of all of the displays, but it's not the first one, actually. It's actually the third, arguably, instance of this theme showing up. The first is in creation itself. You say, well, there's no mountain, there's just a garden. Well, actually, depending on how first off, in creation, you have the ultimate expanse of water, which the Lord himself parts, to bring forth the dry ground. So it's arguable that as the entire earth was one landmass, and if, the Lord reached down and pulls it up, if you will, and if Eden was anywhere near the center, it's quite likely that the entire earth was a giant mountain, or at least if it's one landmass rising up from the sea and the sea has been parted, this idea of out of the seas of chaos, which the Lord has control over, got to keep my rabbit trails under control, to the mountain, in that case Eden, to worship within the garden itself under the orders that the Lord gives. Now, the second time we see it is obviously with Noah. Now, in that time, waters explicitly, again, represent judgment and chaos. They represent both the vileness that the world had become, but also the judging effect on that vileness that Yahweh is laying against them. And we're seeing they're drawn through the waters in the ark. So in the provision of Yahweh to his people, they're brought safely through the waters of judgment to a mountain, literally, to Mount Ararat. They then worshiping Yahweh there. And in that instance, let's see if I flip back over there just to get the text itself. It's not just the judgment that is being satiated. It's once they land on the mountain, okay, in Genesis chapter 9, they land on the mountain, the animals are leaving, and something yet is still to be required. Noah, who is the head of his people, the representative before the Lord, offers a sacrifice, and it's that point, the appropriate and lawful sacrifice, that appropriate and lawful act of worship, that satiates the Lord's judgment. Judgment alone does not... The wicked are to be punished because they're wicked. Just because the wicked are punished doesn't grant you favor. It at best puts you at neutral. So the principle here of wicked to be punished, yes, but the righteous must also be redeemed is being established from the beginning. So in chapter 9 of Genesis, just to show you some of the things here. So, okay. Actually, end of chapter 8. This is verse 20 of chapter 8, the chapter covering the flood subsiding. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, or to Yahweh, and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. If you remember, we've already went over in light detail the importance of the burnt offering aspect, as they are consumed offerings, completely consumed. Okay. And when Yahweh smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature, as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Okay, so then chapter 9, and God blessed Noah and his sons, said to them, be fruitful and multiply. Then we get the rest of the chapter covers the fear of man put on the animals, as well as them distributing. So what we see, though, is that's another instance of the Lord bringing his people through the waters of chaos and judgment to the mountain, to the place of God's choosing, to then have legitimate and lawful worship and fellowship with their God. And that is what we're seeing here back in Exodus 15. The Lord has brought them out from Egypt. He has led them to the sea. The sea both represents the judgment in the sense later on of the Egyptians, but actually to the people, it represents death, which is another aspect of the sea throughout that theme, because initially they consider it to be a roadblock. They consider the fact that the sea is there is death to them. They can't get through. And the Lord turns the means of what would be death into both deliverance for the people and judgment on the enemies of God. And that theme continues to build later on as well, that a means of death can both be a blessing to the people of God and a judgment on the enemies of God, remains throughout the text. We actually see it a few more times as well, but I just wanted to emphasize that. So, yes?
You think there's a correlation there between the death of self to that?
What do you mean specifically?
Like dying to self versus
living
to self.
Obviously, the big correlation here is the act of redemption. But yes, specifically, I would agree that there is that aspect for the individual, that the thing that would seem as to be death to us, which is dying to self, is both a judgment, in a sense, on the wickedness that you're dying from, as you're putting it to death. It's getting the due reward of its death, but it's also the life unto the believer. So, yes, that aspect of that multiple function. The Lord never loses anything, as I've said before. Every aspect is redeemed. Every piece is used fully. We as humans, while we can attempt our best to make use of every resource possible, to make the best use of every resource, we fail drastically. But the Lord never has a piece out of place. Nothing is ever a random rogue piece. Every part of all of creation serves every purpose fully to the intended intent. That's a mouthful. So, we see that. We see Moses declaring, basically, in praise and song, the very thing Yahweh says he's going to do in the previous chapter. So, we see that, and he lists it in the same format that we see Pharaoh being described as coming after them. So, we're seeing that Pharaoh gets his chariot. We see then that Pharaoh gets his chosen chariots. Pharaoh gets all the other chariots and the horsemen and the men. Okay, and in the song where the Lord is, or being praised here, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song, and has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord, or Yahweh, is a man of war. Yahweh is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his host he cast into the sea. His chosen officers were sunk in the sea. The floods covered them. They went down to the depths like a stone. So, in the Song of Praise, we actually see a retelling, or a turning, if you will, of the narrative, saying that Pharaoh went after with his chariots, with his men, with his chosen chariots, his officers. And Moses is retelling it in the Song of Praise, saying, Lord, you've done exactly this. You took care of this problem. You took care of that problem. Nothing's being left out. There's specific address, if you will. Moses is specifically praising God for the specific actions he has taken. And I think from a lesson looking forward, it should remind us to give thanks specifically, to praise the Lord for what he's done specifically. Not that general praise is a bad thing, but that we should be very specific, both when we pray for things, and very specific when we should praise him for things. Because he is a God of specifics. So, we see that. Continuing on, we see... Yes?
I heard that the Red Sea was actually really shallow, like when they crossed.
The Reed Sea?
Yeah. And so how did they sink like a stone and all that?
Well,
the mighty waters covering them.
It was real muddy also.
It was real muddy, yeah.
Well, the first problem is your sources are probably liberal scholars. Just so you know.
So I shouldn't trust the ones that wrote like 3,500, 3,600 years later?
No, definitely not.
Okay.
As we have trouble trusting what the news reports one day after somebody says it, 3,600 years.
That's a good point.
Or the second after somebody says it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but yeah, so specific, and I think I did touch on that last week, but since you were here, I mentioned how we don't know the exact location of the crossing, but archaeologists have found one particular spot, and it's actually, I believe, over on this side, on this horn of the Red Sea, where there is a area covering from bank to bank, littered with Egyptian chariots and Egyptian artifacts of war, probably coincidence, dating from the New Kingdom era. Now, again, I said, well, maybe they just had an unfortunate sailing accident, but you don't put chariots on ships. On top of that, the Egyptians did not maintain a fleet on the Red Sea, as it's technically the border of their province. They wouldn't have had, they also didn't really have ships fit for the Red Sea. So, take it for what it is. Also a mile and a half down, just to give anybody an idea. That's why it's remained hidden.
It's a lot of mud.
A lot of mud. Though sea levels have risen some since then. But mile and a half takes a lot of accumulation. Yes.
Since we're on it, since the beginning of this series, I've thought about the Red Sea crossing because you've referenced the Prince of Egypt a lot. That is my most favorite scene of that entire movie. When the waters part and the crossing it's cool.
So it's not a bad depiction, except for it inaccurately depicts the ground that the Israelites are walking on, as they are not depicted as dry ground in that movie.
I've never seen it.
Yeah, so...
the
Egyptian part's fine. They get covered, except for... Actually, I believe the only other part that's biblically, I would say, accurate is that they at least don't show Pharaoh dying in the sea.
Right.
because Pharaoh specifically we're not told that Pharaoh was killed in the sea. And I think it's important because Pharaoh, the judgment on Pharaoh was the completed thing. It would be an easy out if Pharaoh died. He had to go back to Egypt as the defeated king, you know. We also know historically Tutmosis continued to live for 13 more years and then be succeeded on the throne by his second-born son because his first one had mysteriously died. So,
yeah, I'm in a silly mood today. The Prince of Egypt's like the NIV of Ten Commandments movies. You know, the authorized version with Charlton Heston was good enough for Paul. You know, it's good enough for me.
like as a visual of the crossing, like it's a good scene.
Well, I have to see it.
All the lightning's flashing, you see like a whale.
and they do have some nice dramatic movement. Yes, there is actually a whale swimming beside them on the ocean,
Jonas.
which
Yeah,
isn't actually
cameo.
improbable. I will grant him that's not improbable. If it was any amount of depth, whether it was a mile and a half or not, there's going to be fish swimming on both sides. So like in the storm scene when the lightning's flashing and it lights up the whale, that's sort of cool. But, you know, point being, we are told that they crossed on dry ground for the Israelites, and when the Egyptians began to follow, which also tells us, or at least it eliminates where it's not, simply by distance across. If there was enough space for 2 million people plus animals and wagons to go through before another 600,000 potential, you know, it may not have been that much, but he had a massive army, and even if you count for loss of livestock and men, you know, the entire army of Egypt has been mustered. For them to follow them, the actual linear distance of the crossing had to have been great, because if it's only 300 feet across, then everybody be across in no time. So that does tell us where it's not on the Red Sea, simply because there are parts in the upper, shallow parts, mind you, that aren't very far across. Anywhere where it's of substantial width across, it's an actual sea. You know, anywhere between, you know, 1,000 and a mile and a half deep in places. So we do have to take the natural world's evidences in account as well. And for them to be able to march through on dry ground, and then, because the people of Israel were almost, or at least halfway, let's read from the text, you know, they're thoroughly through before the pillar moves. Because the pillar of fire, the Lord himself, is blocking the Egyptians from following them. So after they're on their way through, the pillar then moves, and the Egyptians go in, at which point the Lord begins to clog their chariot wheels and turn the dry ground back to mud. And it's only after the people of Israel have exited the sea completely that Moses effectively calls, you know, the waters then return, covering them. Now, horses can swim okay, but this, like crossing a river is one thing, being dumped with a mile and a half of water, even if you could swim, you can't get to the top before you run out of air. So, you know, this is a death sentence. So when Moses declares that Yahweh is a man of war, he means it. Now, I do think it's interesting that we get this title here, simply from a historical note, that man of war title is actually ascribed in Egyptian to Tutmosis III quite often, as he is a man of war. He launched 17 consecutive successful campaigns into Canaan, Nubia, and a couple other places, and all the way to India. There are Indian records from one of the southern empires in India documenting communications and envoys with Tutmosis III of Egypt. So they had a very expansive military and trade network. So I just think it's, from our side, interesting and a little bit of ironic poetry there, that this title, that if translated properly comes out to be man of war, is then ascribed by Moses here to the Lord, just showing that complete conquering aspect, that, you know, this great human general, this king of Egypt, is nothing compared to Yahweh, which is the entire point of the entire episode here. As the Lord declared initially, I will make my name great, and I will show my power by or on Pharaoh. So I think we can pick up in verse 19 now, looking at a little bit of commentary here from Moses. For when the horses of Pharaoh with his chariots and his horsemen went into the sea, the Lord or Yahweh brought back the waters of the sea upon them. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground in the midst of the sea. Then Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out with their tambourines and dancing. And Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea." So that one little note there in verse 19 through 21, I would be the final proof for the fact that I believe Pharaoh was not killed in the sea, simply because Moses lists off who was killed in the sea, and Pharaoh is not listed there. We're told his men, his chariots, his horsemen, his hosts, all into the sea, but Pharaoh's not. So it's just an additional point that we also know Tutmosis didn't, even the Egyptians don't record what catastrophe befell them, because they were really good at not doing that. But if you check the records, a couple things happen after this point in Egypt. The first one is Tutmosis III basically goes back to Egypt, and basically for 2 years they're just trying to survive. In that time, he begins a campaign of undoing some stuff. First off, he has every image and mention, inscription of Hatshepsut in the entire kingdom of Egypt scrubbed. Why? Well, it's his stepmother's fault. She's the one that adopted that Hebrew. The second point is, we also have every mention and image of Hatshepsut's nurse. Basically, as we talked about early on, it wasn't uncommon in nobility in any kingdom, but specifically in Egypt in this case, to have nursemaids, both women and eunuchs that serve in the court as well. We know from historical purposes that Hatshepsut had a nursemaid, a eunuch, who took care of her, then took care of her kids, and actually raised Tutmosis III as well, because there's carvings of this man carrying each of them. So he was probably really old by the time he was retired. Well, they don't retire, they just died, but you know what I mean. Well, you're a slave servant, so you don't retire. But even that person has been name scrubbed, and we only know it because of some things he missed that was already buried in some of the tombs. I can't remember that. I have it in my notes that aren't here. But the point is, Tutmosis III took great pains to eliminate both his stepmother, who was Moses' adopted mother, as well as the man who was always by his stepmother's side as far as taking care of the kids, as well as his older stepsister, so we know that from history, anytime something bad has happened, they try to cover it up. Well, to me, that's a strong evidence that there was some bitterness going on. And he blamed her and needed someone to blame, because he's still king. He's got to spin this one way or the other. So it's just interesting to see that. We also know that during the rest of his reign, he never again made any military conquest or attempt. Yes.
There's also this theme in pretty much every ancient culture, that the way to be remembered, to be enshrined, and to be remembered, is to have some form of life, eternal life. And when God forbids the carving of an altar, when he forbids people to seek that kind of vanity, to make images of themselves and all this. It's an act of faith, to trust that we will live before God instead of just simply living in the memory of man.
Right.
And I've actually got a shirt that is by Zinzendorf, the Moravian, and he said on the shirt it says, "Preach the gospel, die, and be forgotten." And it's just thumbing the nose at this idea that, the most important thing is to do something by which you'll be remembered, by people who are also going to die.
Right.
So it's...
No, and I think that is, the Lord continues to humble both Pharaoh and his kingdom, even on into the reign of his son, his second-born son, who was a weak, powerless Pharaoh. Yes.
I was just going to ask one other question about when you were talking about him eliminating all remembrance of these people, and it occurred to me while you were talking about that, about the eunuch that raised him, could he also have been and had in mind Moses' actual biological mother who helped raise him as well, or is this something completely different?
Maybe. I mean, specifically the individual, and I can't remember his name because there's too many Egyptian names in my head right now. This was one particular male figure that shows up over like 3.5 generations of royals. He was most likely the steward of the queen's household. So whichever queen happened to be on the throne, he came with the title. So, he was the one that was over the household, ensuring the kids. Because royal women, and even today, they don't raise their own kids. They never really have, and they probably never will. Unless you happen to be in England right now, where they're trying. But the idea then was that you had the kid, and you went on with your normal duties, and you would ensure the general curriculum of training, but all of the actual rearing is done by some other servant in the court. So it's rather foreign to us today. But this idea of striking it is anybody even related to or could bring to connection. Like we also know Tutmosis III did his very best to strike all the inscriptions and images of Neferure, who is Hatshepsut's only biological child, i.e. Moses' half-stepsister. Getting those connections are little, who was already older than him anyway. She might have already died. But the idea that everything from that side just had to be eliminated. Because if you remember, in the bloodline, Tutmosis III is the lesser son of a lesser son Pharaoh himself, all born through concubines, not the royal queen. While they're legitimate heirs, the actual royal line passed matrilineally down through the woman's side of the bloodline here. So I just think it's important to realize that he's effectively trying to scrub away that taint he's seeing once and for all in that idea. So I think that is important to see. And specifically there, the Lord effectively completes that which he promised to do in striking detail. So far, he's promised Pharaoh that he will humble Pharaoh. He will kill Pharaoh's firstborn, as Pharaoh refused to let his firstborn Israel go. We're then told, Pharaoh, and he lists out all the ones going after him, and then the Lord, destroys them in the sea, and then Moses records in detail who was destroyed in the sea. So the entire account is, if you want to call it a mirror image, where you've got capstones, one on one end, one on the other, and you see the transition as it goes through. So effectively, the entire position is flipped at the end of this narrative. Now, obviously, there's more of Exodus, but specifically here, at the beginning, Pharaoh's on the throne. The people of Israel are enslaved. The people of Egypt are ruling. Egypt is wealthy. The people of Israel are poor. By this point, Pharaoh has been humiliated. His army is destroyed. The kingdom of Egypt is in ruin. Yahweh is ruling. The people of Israel have looted and plundered the entire Egyptian people and are now free on the other side of the sea. So you can see this entire transition here. And no doubt, the weakening of Egypt brought on numerous assaults and attacks from their enemies. So this idea of going from the ruling empire, ruling dynasty, to a broken reed, which Isaiah will later call them, this event in Egyptian history ended Egyptian dominance long term. There was a revival later on in the 21st dynasty with the actual Pharaoh, Ramses II. Not this one, different time. But even then, that was short-lived, and we know that by the time of in Canaan itself, the people are, and by the time of the prophets, Pharaoh is just that second-hand king down there in Egypt that if you lean on him, it's like leaning on a broken reed that will impale your hand. That's the picture Isaiah paints. And the reason is this event. It utterly shatters the people. Or was it Jeremiah? Pretty sure it's Isaiah. Am I mixing them up?
I'm sorry, I was
I was saying, I think
following another rabbit trail.
Oh, sorry. I was saying, I think it's Isaiah that paints.
Yes, Pharaoh's. Yes,
Yeah.
Isaiah.
I knew it was either Isaiah or Jeremiah.
like
So
18 or 19.
yeah, just showing by the point of Isaiah's prophetic ministry, Egypt has plummeted to that you only go talk to the Egyptians when you have no other options because they're probably going to fail you anyway. Idea.
Isaiah 36.
Yeah.
Pierce the hand of anyone who leans on
Right.
it. Yeah.
So, I think we can finish up chapter 15 in a few minutes remaining. Mute this thing. It's my parents' anniversary and I forgot. So there's these group chats. Well, I didn't forget. I'm saying there's group chats going around. And it will continue to sound if I don't do that. So in verse 22, now this is Israel setting out. Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days into the wilderness and found no water. Then they came to Marah, and they could not drink the water of Marah, because it was bitter. Therefore the name was Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" And he cried to the Lord, he cried to Yahweh, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and it became sweet. There the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them, saying, "If you will diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God, and do which is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commandments and his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer." Then they came to Elim, where they were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the water. Now, if you say that's sort of weird to have this massive, dramatic military conquest, and you have this little thing going, but it's really not. It's actually a precursor looking forward. The first thing we see is they've gone 3 days since the sea, and they're complaining about not having water. There's actually some poetic irony coming in here. It's almost as if 3 days ago you saw the Lord split the Red Sea, and now you're complaining about not having water? Really? That's sort of the way you should actually read Moses's, that's what's coming through. And then they go to Marah, where the water is bitter, hence why it's named Marah, and the people grumbled against Moses, "What shall we drink?" So he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and it became sweet. Now, we're not told they then go and drink up, but the emphasis there is that they're thirsty, they're complaining, and I do think it's ironic that the way the water is going from bitter to sweet is something has to be thrown into it. Almost bringing to mind the fact that your escape was made bitter to sweet by throwing all the Egyptians into the sea. There's this idea here that's like, oh, you need a reminder of what just happened, people? And as we see through the rest of Exodus and the entire rest of the Pentateuch, from here on out, Moses just has to get a little snappier and snappier with them because the people get harder and harder and harder. But this idea that 3 days in and they've already forgotten and are complaining about water when the Lord just parted the sea and drowned the entire Egyptian army in the sea by his command, so it's...
That's the week is long. People's estimation of their own spiritual strength is usually too high, and that's why midweek service is so important, among other reasons.
Right. So in conclusion, there we're then told, and Yahweh made a statute and a rule, and there he tested them, saying, "If you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, and do that which is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commandments, and keep his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer." So, first off, we're told that he's creating a litmus test for his people, right off the bat, because they're already complaining. But then we're told this test has 3 points to it. The first is, will you diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God? So, here, will you do that which is right in his eyes regarding your actions? And give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes. So it's this idea of twice repeated, hear and do, hear and do. So diligently listen and do which is right in his eyes, and give ear and keep his statutes. So it's a reinforcement. Anytime the Lord rephrases, he's often reinforcing something. Yes.
So I was thinking, 3 days is actually a long time to go without water. And I don't think God forgot that they needed water. So I'm wondering if it was a little bit of a test to just see how they would respond to it. Because they could have handled it very differently.
Right.
And it would have gone very differently. And they could have done
Oh,
that
no, absolutely. It's not that 3 days with no water. It wasn't that he was punishing them for being thirsty. The issue at hand is that they have already forgotten that their God just split the Red Sea and let them through. And now they're grumbling and complaining about having nothing to drink.
They could have just asked.
Right. But this group of people doesn't just ask. They grumble first and punish later. Yes, Walt.
I was just going to think, and I know this is one of those things that a lot of times has been discussed. And, it's like why would they complain so quickly, And we can look back and think seem like, why did you forget so soon, And but I also think sometimes that that's really a picture of us as everybody. I mean, like as human beings, as human nature. Because I think I think I would probably start getting a little bit concerned if I was out in the middle of the desert and there was no water. I might start asking, can somebody go ask Moses what the plan is here, because I don't see any water. And, before too much longer, that's going to turn into panic.
Right.
And I just think of myself is that I would probably be one of the ones that would be saying, what is the water?
Right. And ultimately, that is a major part of when reading the Old Testament. It's never to, and I think it was Dr. Sproul that said this, Dr. Sproul Sr., when we read something, we're never supposed to say, oh, those people. We're supposed to say, oh, look, us, because that's exactly what we as people would be doing too. Now, we are supposed to look at it and say what we're not supposed to do and glean that. But at the same time, we do need to realize that human nature hasn't changed regardless of what year it is. So, and then in conclusion there, we're told, if you do this and keep my statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer. So they have one final reminder there of all of the diseases and plagues that struck Egypt. And the Lord's declaring that he's in control of them, because as we've already established, the greater commands or directs the lesser. So the Lord must be greater than diseases to be able to inflict diseases. And he must be greater than diseases in order to prevent diseases from attacking them if they obey. So the first thing is he's declaring that he is sovereign over diseases on earth. The second thing is he's declaring that he's their healer. Now, to the host that came out of Egypt, this should ring as a bell, because, in the Egyptian pantheon, Isis, the goddess of healing, and one of the others that was the god of medicine, they played a big part, because the Egyptians are clean freaks and, medicinal freak people. They always wanted to be clean. Everything had to be right. So this idea that their gods were worthless in the face of Yahweh's plagues should be ringing true to the people here, that the Lord is declaring he is their healer. It's that idea of, don't look to those pagan fake deities, look to me for healing. And then we're told, and when they came to a limb where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the water. Now, you say, oh, well, that's nice. Well, it is nice. But it's more than nice in the sense of, you remember, they have now left Egypt. They have formally left Egypt. But if you throw back to the end of Genesis, there were 12 brothers and 70 persons that entered into Egypt with the house of Jacob. So I think it's no coincidence that this place where they stopped for refuge on their way out of Egypt happens to have exactly 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. The probability of this happening naturally is so far out there I don't even know how to calculate it. You know, trees are rare, people cut them down. You know, if this had been a natural thing, well, what if somebody had went by and needed some wood the day before? Or what if whoever normally lived there cut them all down and took them with them because they saw the Israelites coming? That's more likely. But the idea here is that we're told in the text that as this completion, this progression, this capstone, it should remind us that they went from 12 brothers and 70 persons to 2 million-esque people, and now the Lord's leading them out. So, that concludes chapter 15. Any quick questions? Because I'm over time. Yes, Floyd?
What kind of trees grew in the desert early on? Or did they?
I would have to look that up. I mean, we know the palms, like date palms, probably some of the similar trees that grow in the desert today. But desert is also a varied term. So if we're referring to Egyptian desert, you know.
The palm tree got the best cabbage you can eat. You eat the heart of it.
Right.
That's
The heart of the palm. So,
they were eating to survive.
but
So.
it's still red. It's still going. Yeah, we're good.